Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Today, we are really pleased to welcome Dr. Anthony Dixon. He is a public historian, archivist, lecturer, and author who focuses on the African diaspora. He's conducted lectures, served as a panelist, researched, and published pertinent information concerning the African diaspora. Today, he is here to share with us about his new book, which focuses on the role of Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War. So we are really excited to learn from Dr. Dixon today and are looking forward to hearing what he has to say. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Dixon. Take it away.
Good afternoon. Our story actually begins at almost the very beginning. At the first settlement of the Spanish in La Florida, Gueldape. At Gueldape, first, let me start over. First, I'd like to say that with the African diaspora in Florida, it has a uniqueness unlike any other state. And the story of the Black Seminoles and the Florida Maroons demonstrate the ideas of freedom and the ideas of freedom from the very beginning of its inception. And when I say it, I mean La Florida itself. At the beginning at Gueldape, the first settlement, the Wally Native Americans enticed the African enslaved to rebel. When they attacked the settlement, the enslaved Africans began to set fire to Gueldape, and this burned the settlement down. And a small number of those Africans then absconded into the woods to eke out a living with the Native Americans. Now, this starts our very first inkling of the Florida Maroons. We won't see the number of Maroons beginning to rise until the 17th century. In the 17th century, there began a competition over America, over North America, particularly between the Spanish and the English. And the Spanish understood that the English were going to succeed as far as their number of enslaved Africans, that they were overwhelmed, or not overwhelmed, they were entrenched with plantation society. And so the number of enslaved Africans that they were able to bring in meant an equal equivalency to how well they were going to expand and grow in North America. So there began this competition between the Spanish and the English. And so the Spanish began to seek out ways to slow down English advancement. And by the late 17th century, the late 1600s, they realized that if they could do something with the labor supply, then they could slow down the English advancement. And what happens is they start noticing a number of absconded African individuals that are leaving the English plantation society and leaving English colonies and coming down further south into La Florida. And so word was sent in the late 1600s, in the 1680s, late 1680s, to the Crown. And they basically asked them, what do you want us to do with these individuals? Now, of course, this is a period of time where nothing happens overnight. And it takes 5 years for an official verdict. from the Crown. But the Crown sends back an official notice in which we call the Edict of 1693. And with the Edict of 1693, the Crown basically says any Africans that escaped from the English colonies and now from under English plantation society can come into La Florida and live free. Now, this was key, living free. What developed was two different societies. The Florida Maroon Society, in which these Africans were living out in the Florida wilderness, eking out their own existence, particularly along the St. Johns River. And then there was Fort Mose. At this fort, Blacks placed themselves under Spanish authority and lived at a fort just outside of St. Augustine. Now, there's been conjecture between historians on whether or not these Africans were actually living free. The first thing that they had to do was accept Catholicism. The second thing was they had to live under the authority and the rules of Spanish society. Now, some have argued that they were not living free. And then there are those that believe that there were freedom, they were complete citizens and treated as equal citizens under Spanish authority, but they were free. Now, for those that were living in the wilderness, they were eking out their own existence, cohabitating with Native Americans whenever possible, and eking out their own existence. They were completely free. They began to develop their own culture, which stemmed from Gullah culture. Gullah culture was a mixture of West African culture and English plantation culture. It even had its own dialect, to which we call Geechee. Now, in time, as things began to develop, the Gullah language, which we call again Geechee, began to develop for the Florida Maroons into what we call the ASC language, the Afro-Seminole Creole language. With the Afro-Seminole Creole language, this began a mixture of West African languages, English plantation language, and Native American words. So the relationship between Blacks and Native Americans were beginning to grow even stronger, particularly as we move into the 18th century and into the 1700s, where more and more Native Americans were also trying to escape English plantation society. As we move forward into the 18th century, more and more Native Americans from smaller tribes began to cohabitate together. Then there's a large schism between the Creek Nation. This schism actually is primarily over the concept or the issue of slavery. Southern Creeks, who had more interactions with the now growing Georgia planters, began to accept slavery and accept plantation society. Whereas the Northern Creeks, who lived more in northern Alabama up into the mountainous areas, rejected plantation society, and they rejected the idea of long-term slavery. They turned to their Southern counterparts and they asked them, what are you doing? We take people as prisoners of war. We may keep the women, of course, to keep our numbers up, but we certainly don't force them to work forever and then tell them that their children's children and their children are our slaves as well. So what are you doing? And so there's a great schism there between it. So the Northern Creeks pushed their way down southward through the Southern Creeks, and they come into La Florida. And they began to interact not only with these Africans who have absconded now for a few generations. So we have some Africans and quote unquote African Americans now as Florida Maroons. But they also began to intermingle with those smaller groups of Native Americans that were fighting for survival. And so by the 1750s, they were recognized by both the Spanish as well as the English as the Seminoles. Now there's been a development in how that term came to be, particularly through the language barrier, Cimarron, Seminola, Semolina, and then Seminole. But the basic meaning is renegade or runaway Creek. And so by the time we get to the 1750s, we have this homogenized group of Native Americans that are now being called the Seminoles, who are living in the wilderness and eking out their existence in La Florida, particularly in North Florida in this particular time and along the St. Johns River. And you have those African descendants who are now being pushed westward, away from St. Johns River and away from the coast as Georgia Plantation Society expands. So in the area between Gainesville and Tallahassee, there starts to be a group of growing Native Americans and a growing group of Florida Maroons. As they began to develop, they began to further develop their culture. We see the Afro-Seminole Creole language taking on more and more and expanding with more and more Native American words. We start seeing areas being controlled and dominated by the Seminoles and the Florida Maroons. We see them expanding westward toward Pensacola. We see more and more English and Spanish being concentrated in certain areas, particularly on the East Coast for the English, and then in Pensacola and in St. Augustine for the Spanish, and everything in the middle in that wilderness between being dominated by the Florida Seminoles and the Florida Maroons. Now, as time develops, through the 18th century, through the 1700s, things began to change. The first major change is that for a period of about 20 years, the English take over La Florida. And they bring in plantation society even more into La Florida. Now they bring it in more primarily along the St. Johns River, down into the St. Augustine area. So we start seeing two distinct groups now between those African descendants that are living as maroons, and then those African descendants that are living under plantation society and enslaved. Unfortunately, during those changes and those skirmishes between the English and the Spanish, Fort Mose is destroyed. It is rebuilt, but then it is removed during those period of 20 years. So it never regains its strength as it had in the earlier parts of the century. As we move toward the end of the 1700s, we have another change, of course. We have the American Revolution. And with the American Revolution, we see a major shift with plantation society and with the relationship between the English and the English speakers and the Spanish. The Spanish regain La Florida from the English, but they're never as strong as they once were. Matter of fact, they are actually weak representatives at best. English plantation society has a foothold in the area now and is basically dominating the economy. So the Spanish authorities who are collecting taxes are basically collecting taxes from plantation society and gaining their wealth off of English and of now American plantation society as well. Now, as far as the area between the Swanee River all the way out through the Panhandle, we see it still being dominated by Native Americans and the Florida Maroons. And their relationship begins to solidify. They begin to have rules on their interactions and the overall relationship between the two groups. Cohabitation began to increase, but it was a stipulation among the cohabitators. a person was not considered a Native American unless they could find their way or have direct lineage into the matrilineal clan. In other words, it was decided upon the mother. Therefore, if you had a Black Seminole, you had a Black, rather, that had both Seminole heritage and African heritage, if their mother was a Native American, then they belonged to the Native American clan. They belong to the Seminole Native Americans. If their father, however, was a Native American, then they did not belong to a matrilineal clan, and they still belong and was considered to be a Florida Maroon. They also developed what they called the tribute fields. Now, this was very important as well. There were 3 fields that were done by both groups. Native Americans had their own field where they grew their crops. The Florida Maroons had their field where they grew their crops. And then there was a 3rd field, which was considered a tribute field, in which they worked this field together, but the proceeds went to the Native Americans for protection. This was also important when it came down to dealing with property rights. Property rights and things of that nature were dealt with through the elders. And they dealt with different issues primarily during a festival, which was the Corn Bus Festival. However, this is key. You could not participate in the Corn Bus Festival unless you belonged to a clan. Therefore, what we're saying is only those who had mixed heritage through their mother as a Native American could participate in the Corn Bus Festival. Grievances between Florida Maroon and Native Americans were handled through an independent way of counsel, in which negotiations between the hierarchies would take place. But it would not, it's important to understand, it would not be a part of the elders' decision within the Corn Bus Festival. They would have to have their grievances solved through another channel. And so this was the relationship that developed throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. Now, as we get into the 19th century, the Seminole Native Americans and the Florida Maroons find themselves facing their biggest adversary, which is the Americans. the Americans began to eye that land between the Ochlockonee River and the Swanee River. They began to realize that the soil between those two rivers was as fertile as the land in Georgia, and in some areas, even better than some of the cotton lands in Georgia. So the United States began, particularly the Georgia planters, began to seek out ways to get this land from the Spanish and rid themselves of the Seminoles and the Black Maroons that lived and occupied the area. When we get into the War of 1812, which of course I tell my students all the time, that was the war that established the United States. It took 2 wars for the United States to actually become a country. We always put emphasis on the American Revolution, but it also took the War of 1812, because without the War of 1812, the rest of the world would not have recognized the United States as an independent government. And so it took both of these wars for the United States to really gain its independence. But during this war, they had another war called the Patriots War. And this war was fought primarily over ports. Port of Tampa, Panama City, Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, and New Orleans. We hear a lot about New York and Philadelphia and Charleston, as they were very important ports to the U.S. economy. But these were considered the international ports that were going to the Caribbean, where many of the revenue was still being generated. So these were very, very important ports. And so the English and the Americans were fighting over these ports. Now, here's the real kicker about that. These ports were in Spanish territory. So you see, you have the true weakness of the Spanish authority being shown here, that you had the English and the Americans that were fighting control over these ports when they were really still in La Florida. And so they began, and when I say they, I mean the United States as well as the British, began to recruit people in the area to fight this Patriots War. And they ended up recruiting both Blacks and Native Americans. The English were the primary recruiters of the Seminoles and the Florida Maroons. They utilized them to protect these forts. However, of course, the British were forced out of North America And the United States ended up gaining control over these ports. Now, here's a key aspect. As the British were leaving, they recognized the importance of the contributions that the Seminoles and the Florida Maroons gave them. So they left the Florida Maroons a fort to defend themselves with. And that fort became known as the Negro Fort. It's located about 65 miles southwest of present-day Tallahassee, Florida, in Franklin County. Now, this sent shockwaves. Through plantation society, not only in Georgia, but in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in the Tennessee Territory. Because they felt as long as their enslaved blacks knew that there were blacks living free in that close proximity, then it would entice them to run away. Also, they understood that a fort was key on the progression to a colony, and a colony on the progression to a territory. And so they could not have a black colony that was built by runaway enslaved individuals in close proximity to plantation society. They felt that that was a direct threat to the growth of plantation society, that they would never be able to reach their fullest potential if blacks knew that they could live free in nearby Florida. Something had to be done. And so, plantation society enticed Andrew Jackson. They enticed him once he left the Battle of New Orleans, not to stop there, but to come back into La Florida and do something about this Negro Fort. It must be destroyed. And so, Andrew Jackson, without any authority out of Washington, D.C., without any authority of his superiors, obliged. And he came into La Florida and he ordered the destruction of the Negro Fort. Now, how the fort was destroyed has also come into conjecture. For years, we felt and believed that a hot shot, which is a cannonball that is placed in a fiery pit and then shot out, hit the magazine and it blew the entire fort up. There have been evidence that this may not have been the complete destruction of the fort, that they may have come on land and it became a massacre. However the case may be, the fort was destroyed. The blacks living there that survived were dispersed into the wilderness, as well as the Native Americans and the Seminole, Native American Seminoles, who were cohabitating around the fort. Andrew Jackson doesn't stop there. He turns northward and he goes towards a large cohabitation of Native Americans called Fowlestown. And he destroys Fowlestown. Now, when he destroys Fowlestown, many Florida historians say that this was the beginning of the First Seminole War. However, there are historians like myself that say no. When he destroys the Negro Fort, even the Native Americans themselves said that they were going to get revenge for the destruction of the Negro Fort. And that when he destroys the Negro Fort, that is when the First Seminole War began. So you have these two concepts of when the First Seminole War actually began. But it takes place from 1818 to 1819. Seminoles and Florida Maroons are pushed out of the area and down southward in the present day Tampa Bay area and as far over as Lake County. Now, here's what we must understand about the First Seminole War and the overall history of the state of Florida. When the war ends in late 1818, just months later, the United States government signs a treaty with the Spanish government, which cedes Florida over to the United States beginning in 1821. So basically they gave them 2 years to get their affairs in order, 2 years worth of collecting taxes, and then Florida would become a territory of the United States. So we can see a direct linkage between the First Seminole War, when skirmishes really beginning in 1817 and ending in late 1818, and Florida being ceded over to the United States in 1819 with the treaty as a direct linkage. So there's a direct link between the First Seminole War and Florida becoming a territory. Now, we know that Andrew Jackson becomes the first territorial governor. He's appointed. He gets bit with the political bug in Florida. He doesn't stay long. He goes, he leaves, and years later, he becomes president. In that time, the relationship between the Seminoles and the Florida Maroons and the United States, particularly the Florida Territory, changes. The first relationship between Seminole Native Americans and the Florida Maroons change. They go into a formal agreement. And at this point, just after the First Seminole War, we stop calling them the Florida Maroons and we call them the Black Seminoles. The relationship between the Seminole Nation now and the Florida Territory worsens. The land that the Seminoles are removed to, particularly in late and developing what we now call Orange County, is uninhabitable. Now, we think about Lake County now, we think about Orange County and all the pretty pristine lakes that they're there now and they're known for. But if you could imagine the 1800s, it was swampy, uninhabitable land. Therefore, many of the Seminoles began, and when I say Seminoles now, you have to understand we're talking about Seminole Native Americans and Blacks now, began to return to North Florida. They returned to the Gainesville area. They returned to the Tallahassee area. And they refused to capitulate to the treaties that were signed at the end of the First Seminole War. Now, here's a key issue there. By this time, authorities in the Florida Territory and citizens alike in the Florida Territory would like to rid themselves of the Seminoles altogether. Andrew Jackson has now given them the authority with the Indian removal policy. And I tell my students all the time and make it key, those ideas that Andrew Jackson got for the Indian removal policy stem from his time down in La Florida. And so in the 1830s, another war ensues. The Florida Territory wants the Seminoles to remove themselves out west to the Arkansas Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. They want the Black contingency, the Black Seminoles, to be returned to slavery. Although there's a number of them, there are generations now that were born into freedom, that were born out in the wilderness and through those years living as maroons. It did not matter to the Southern planters. As far as the Southern planters were belonged, they still were the property of the planter. Therefore, Native Americans should be removed out west, and the Black Seminoles should be returned to slavery. And so for that reason, a Second Seminole War ensued. The Second Seminole War became the longest, deadliest, and costliest Native American war fought by the U.S. government. We hear a lot about Geronimo and a lot about Sitting Bull, but it is actually the Seminoles who fought the hardest. And when you examine those that were really fighting, it is the Black Seminoles that exuded the fierceness and the leadership to keep the war going the way that it did for the first couple of years. Now, what happens is that about halfway through the war, in 1838, many are believing to doubt the reasons behind the war. Even the general in charge questions whether or not it is an Indian war or a large slave-catching expedition. He even writes to authorities in DC and says, this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war. And so, with abolitionists watching in DC, they began to change their ideas about the objectives of the Second Seminole War. And so what happens is they include articles that says basically that the Native Americans and their quote unquote allies can go out west and live free. Now, for Black Seminoles, that was victory. That was what they fought for. And so we see many Black Seminoles beginning to surrender and go out west to live free. And this starts the negative relationship within the Seminole Nation between Native Americans and Blacks. And so Native Americans are questioning the Black Seminoles on why they are giving up, why they're stopping the fight. And the Black Seminole leadership understood that the Seminole Nation could not defeat the United States government. And then they also reminded their Native American counterpart that freedom was the primary objective for the Black Seminoles. Whether it be free in La Florida, free in Florida, or free in the Arkansas Territory. Freedom was the primary objective. And so we start seeing a change in the relationship between Native Americans and Black Seminoles once they get out west. And it is not a pretty situation at times, to say the least. Nevertheless, the war continues on to 1842, when the Seminoles finally, large contingency, finally agree to immigrate out west. And for those who stayed after, those in the Seminole Nation that stayed after the Second Seminole War, they were pushed even further south into the Lake Okeechobee area and parts of South Florida. Now, there was a third Seminole War. And it goes with the progression also of Florida. Because you have to understand, at the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, a mere 3 years later, Florida gained statehood. The Tampa and Orlando areas are opened up. So here again, we see the progression of the state of Florida having a direct lineage with how the Seminoles are going in the state of Florida as well. Again, end of the First Seminole War, Florida becomes a territory. End of the Second Seminole War, 3 years later, Florida becomes a state. The Third Seminole War was fought in the 1850s. The state of Florida wanted to move into South Florida, and they wanted to rid themselves of the last vestiges of the Seminoles. So a Third Seminole War was fought. They did not rid themselves of all Seminoles. They did not exterminate the Seminoles, nor did they remove all of the Seminoles. But they reduced their numbers far enough that they felt that they would not impede any progress into South Florida. Now, before they could actually get into South Florida and begin to develop South Florida, in the late 1850s, early 1860s, of course, we have the Civil War, and Florida joins the Confederacy. And so those plans are put off. But had it not been for those plans, then Florida would have moved into South Florida in the Lake Okeechobee area just after the Third Seminole War. We would have seen the last development of Florida with a direct connection to the Seminoles. And so what we see in dealing with the Seminole Nation and the Black Seminoles is a direct correlation on how Florida develops as a state. It is also a lesson in understanding how a multicultural society was created. Because as Blacks began to develop themselves after plantation society ends, we see also the state of Florida being developed into modern times. I'd like to thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time to explain the story of the Black Seminoles and how they directly relate to the Seminole Nation, as well as the state of Florida. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It was really interesting. So I think it's 5 o'clock, but if anybody has any quick questions, I think we could take a couple from the audience. So you can put that in the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom. But, I personally, had heard about, the Black Seminoles, but I did not realize how very involved they were. Let's see, here is a question. Can you tell us about any of the Maroon communities in Alachua County?
There were smaller communities around the Gainesville area, particularly because of Micanopy. He was the primary Native American chief, so they looked for protection under his area. Now, Palikalikaha is just outside of Alachua County, but it is the primary Black Seminole area that was tied to the Gainesville band of Seminoles.
We have another question asking if you have anything you can share about the role of Edmund Pendleton Gaines.
No, I don't have any specific ideas right now that come to mind, to be honest with you, and I don't want to throw and go off on a tangent that might be wrong. So let me think clear of that right now.
Yeah, I think, again, avoiding going off on a tangent, I believe that there was conflict between Andrew Jackson and General Gaines over who was kind of in charge in some of this. There was a bit of confusion between the two of them. Let's see. If you were to pick one story or person or event to share with K through 12 students that would help understand Black Seminoles, what would it be? That's a very good question.
I think it would be a tie, to be honest with you. I'd have to discuss two men. I'd have to discuss Abraham, who was a runaway slave that ended up becoming a Black Seminole leader and the primary Black Seminole chief, and the primary advisor to Seminole Chief Micanopy. And then also go for John Cavajalo, who was a mixture of a Black Seminole mother and a Native American father. And he became a Black Seminole chief during the war. And then he became the Black Seminole chief while they were out in the Arkansas Territory. So to look at those two men's lives, one who grew up and first as an enslaved individual and then was there at the beginnings of the Maroon Societies, and then one that grew up within the Maroon Society and ended up being a leader through the freedom portion of the Black Seminole story. I think those two men's stories really tell a story of the Black Seminole.
All right, so we've got two more questions here, and I think those are going to be the last two. So starting with this one that I think is particularly interesting is, are there any records or stories of Black Seminole women?
Yes, there were Black Seminole women who were actually leaders as well. There was one called Buckatown, and that was a Black Seminole encampment that was led by a woman. And she was known as a fierce competitor as well. So there are some leadership within the women in the Black Seminole community.
Great, thank you. And then the last question that we have is, were the Native American Seminoles involved in the trading or capturing / returning of Africans to slavery?
That is the question that is often had to be taught with a serious understanding. There was an understanding between the Seminole Nation and Plantation Society in Florida that they would not stop any plantation owner from claiming their enslaved individual. However, they had an understood agreement with the blacks that if you escaped again, you are more than welcome to come back home. So in terms of keeping peace between the whites and the Seminole Nation Native Americans, they would allow plantation owners to come and get their newly absconded, enslaved individuals. They would not stop them from taking them back to plantation society. But on the same token, if they came back, they would not report them either.
Great, thank you. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us this afternoon. I think that everybody enjoyed it. We had some really good comments in the chat, thanking you for sharing. And thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon. We appreciate you taking some time out of your weekend to spend it with us. And I hope that you'll join us. Our next program will be welcoming author and journalist Craig Pittman to talk about his newest book, The State You're In, and that will be February 19th, also at 4 o'clock. And we are hoping that that one will be both online and in person. So be sure to check our website for the most up-to-date information there. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you for